Welcome to On TESOL's video series for new teachers. Each short video gives you a new tool to broaden your teaching skills. The topic of this video is teaching vocabulary. I'm Aaron, and I'll be sharing some practical tips with you that I've learned through years of teaching. Let's get started. Vocabulary is an important part of every lesson, regardless of which skill we're focusing on. Teaching vocabulary is a little different than teaching grammar, writing, or other concept-based skills. In this video, my goal is to help you think about ways of more effectively incorporating vocabulary instruction into your planning and teaching. I will demonstrate three main principles. First, how do we incorporate vocabulary into our lesson plans? Second, what are some strategies that we can use to introduce new words to students? And finally, once we've introduced the words, how do students practice and integrate them with words they already know? When teaching new vocabulary, we want our students to master the words that we're teaching them. The goal is for them to understand them in a variety of contexts and be able to use them appropriately. What does mastery require? It requires thorough and clear explanation of new words, repetition of those words in a variety of contexts, connecting those words to existing knowledge that students have, and review over time. It doesn't happen in one class. Let's go through the process of decision-making that happens when we're planning a lesson focusing on how vocabulary fits into the process. First, imagine that the lesson that you want to teach in your grammar class is on the comparative. To teach the comparative, you want to focus on a theme, and you've chosen finding an apartment to rent. It's always challenging to know how much vocabulary we want to introduce to students in a single lesson, but usually I like to introduce 10 to 15 words that I think will be new. Part of the problem is making this decision arises from the fact that within a class there are always a variety of levels. Because of this, we need to do some form of what we call differentiated instruction. How does new vocabulary enter the lesson? Ideally, it will come from a few places. One way to bring new words into your lesson is to elicit it from students. This helps you do a little diagnostic test on what they know to help you determine where they need to go. Students might also ask questions. These questions can lead to teachable moments in which new vocabulary will arise in context of the lesson. Finally, a lot of the words that are going to come into your lesson will come from the materials that you bring there that you've planned in advance to help students achieve the goals for those lessons. So back to our lesson on renting an apartment. You'll remember that the target goal for the lesson is comparative adjectives. I would start this lesson by eliciting any adjectives that students already know that could be useful in describing apartments. Then I would present some words in context. I would give students a number of short advertisements, advertising apartments, maybe taken from the internet, and ask them to find all of the adjectives in those advertisements. Next, I would ask students some guiding questions to help them decode the meaning of the adjectives that they saw in the articles. We can ask questions like, do you think this adjective is indicating something positive or negative? Or what other words sound like this word that you've seen before? It's really important that we don't always give students the correct meaning of the word immediately because they need to learn how to infer meanings from context. And once they've worked hard to understand the meaning of the word themselves, I would clear up any ambiguity by asking a few concept-checking questions. In the case of this lesson, I could ask a student, so is the apartment that you live in spacious or crowded? We don't use words in isolation, so part of what we need to teach when we teach vocabulary is how words interact with each other. One of the major barriers that face higher level students is the mastery of English collocation, which refers to the co-occurrence of words and phrases. If I'm introducing the verb commit, which really in a lot of cases means something like do, it's really important that students understand what nouns that they would see in combination with it to use it correctly. Otherwise, it's not going to be a very useful verb for them. When you're teaching adjectives, it's really useful to teach their opposites. This helps students get a clearer understanding of the meaning of the word. It's also really important that you teach the connotations of words. So if we have the word cheap, does that have a positive connotation or a negative connotation? In some cases, this can be confusing for students. It's important, if they're going to use these words correctly, that we teach whether the word has a positive or a pejorative connotation. Once you've introduced and explained some of the new vocabulary, you're ready for the students to practice and produce it. One way of doing this is in a task-based context. In the example of renting an apartment as a topic for a lesson, the students could do landlord and tenant negotiations. Students are given the role of either landlord and tenant, and they have to meet each other to talk and negotiate a lease. So you would have students walking around, talking to each other, and trying to make a deal, while also making sure they're thinking about using that grammar point, the comparative, to justify their choices. They could do this in writing once the negotiation time is up. When the main activity is complete, you'll want the students to reflect on and review some of the most important vocabulary that they used in the activity. You could do this playing a game like Family Feud, if you're familiar with that, where students would predict what 10 expressions or words they would hear in a conversation between a landlord and a tenant. That way, students are really focusing on the most important and relevant vocabulary and expressions that they used in the activity. As I said earlier, mastery of new vocabulary does really take a long time. If you end your lessons with a short writing task or assign some writing for homework, the students will have a chance to revisit the vocabulary later, and will also give you a chance to make sure that they're using it accurately and give them feedback on their use of the new words. While correcting the writing that they've done for homework, make a note of the words students are struggling with and make sure that you address it later. When students begin class the next day, you could begin with a review of the vocabulary from the day before, either with a game or simply by asking students to create sentences with those words. Again, the important thing is that they're reviewing in small doses over long periods of time to make sure that they see the words in a variety of contexts and use them correctly. Thanks again for joining us. Hope you found this useful. We'll see you soon.